Over the past few weeks, our Old Testament readings have been from the book of Job. We haven't looked at any of them, concentrating instead on our Gospel readings each week. So this time we're going to have a look at the whole book of Job. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into all 42 chapters in detail, but we're going to have a quick overview of the story and then think about what we can learn about God and about suffering. Whether or not the book of Job is about a real man and what happens to him, or a fictional story about God and suffering in the world, doesn't really matter. What is important is that it's in the Bible to address some important questions about why there is suffering in the world. Is it God's fault? Is God good? Is suffering a punishment? So let's begin with a summary of the story of Job. Job was a man who lived in a place called Uz. He was wealthy with lots of livestock, lots of servants, a lovely home and lots of children. Job was a good man and he loved God. One day, we're told, God had a meeting with all the heavenly beings, including Satan. God points out to Satan how amazing Job is. He holds Job up as a good example. Job does nothing wrong and loves God. But Satan argues that Job only loves God because God has blessed him so much. And he questions whether Job would still love God if bad things happened to him. So God tells Satan he can do whatever he wants to Job. But he mustn't harm Job himself. All of Job's livestock are either stolen or destroyed. Most of his servants are killed, and all of his children die in a storm. Job is obviously devastated by this. But he doesn't blame God. He still worships God and says that God is good. Satan then goes back to God and says that he's sure that Job would stop loving God if something happened to physically harm Job as well. God says that Satan can do this, but he mustn't kill Job. So Satan inflicts Job with painful sores all over his body. They're so painful that he even uses bits of broken pottery to scratch at his skin in an attempt to get a little bit of relief. And yet Job still loves and worships God. Even his wife says he should give up on God now and die. But still, Job says that God is good. Why should we accept blessings from God, but not bad things, he asks. Some of Job's friends come along. To begin with, they just sit with him because they can see how much he is suffering. But after a week, they start asking him what he's done wrong to deserve to be punished in this way. Surely Job must have done some pretty awful things for God to have done all this to him. Job starts to wish he was dead. In fact, he wishes he'd never been born. Most of the rest of the book of Job consists of his friends arguing that he must have done something really bad, Job saying that God is unfair, and Job wondering if God is in fact good at all. Then in the final few chapters, God responds to Job's accusations of injustice and points out how little Job understands about the world, how it was created and how it works. How Job could never understand why some things happened and why some things don't. God points out to Job just how small he is in the grand scheme of things. And then we get to the reading set for today. Job admits that God is still good despite everything he has gone through. He repents of doubting God and turns back to him again. God tells Job's friends that they were totally wrong to think that what had happened to Job was a punishment. And then God rebuilds all that was lost from Job's life at the hands of Satan, with him getting twice as much as he had before everything was taken away. So what does this story teach us about God and about suffering? Well, it teaches us several really important things. Firstly, bad things happening in our lives aren't a punishment from God. Sometimes bad things happen to us as a consequence of something we've done, but that's very different to them being a punishment from God. God doesn't deal in karma. It's not a case of be good enough and nothing bad will happen to you, or be bad enough and you'll suffer lots. Sometimes bad things happen to us because we live in a world that is broken, a world where people hurt other people, a world where we have damaged the environment so much that it means natural disasters happen. We live in a world where there is death and decay, which means things go wrong with our bodies and people sadly get ill and die. I remember once when I was going through a really difficult time and I asked the question, why does it have to happen to me? And someone very wise, rather annoyingly said, well, why not you? Bad stuff, difficult stuff happening in our lives doesn't necessarily happen because of anything we have or haven't done. Difficult stuff does happen to everyone. It's part of being human. Secondly, when we go through a tough time, God will always be there for us. God never leaves us to face the tough times on our own. Even when Job eventually got cross with God and questioned God's goodness, God didn't abandon Job. Yes, God challenged Job. Yes, God reminded Job that he really had no understanding of how the world works. But God stayed there. It's actually okay to question God and even get cross with God. God is big enough to take all our difficult emotions. God knows we're human. And because God came to earth in human form as Jesus, we know that God totally understands what it's like to be human and to experience all the different human emotions. The Psalms have so many examples of King David, who God described as being a man after his own heart, and others doubting God's goodness, questioning whether God was fair, and getting angry with God for what was happening in their own lives and in the wider world. Those psalms wouldn't be included in the Bible if it was wrong to get cross with God. Actually, I think that God would far rather we shouted at him than be apathetic or turn our backs on him. Just as God stayed with Job in the suffering, so God will always, always stay with us when we're suffering too. God promises never to leave us by ourselves. Finally, even though bad things happen, even when we suffer, it doesn't mean that there aren't good things too. In this life, there will always be suffering in some form, but there will always, always be blessings as well. At the end of the story of Job, God blesses him with twice what he had before. Not as a reward, deciding once again that God was good, but because God blesses us all. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that the fact that Job went on to have more children didn't wipe out the pain from having lost his first children. Nothing, no one, could replace them, but having more children did bring joy and blessing back into his life, as children in their own rights. Earlier in the book of Job, when he's still in the middle of his suffering and grief, Job acknowledges that God is good all the time, and that we should love and worship God when things are going our way and when things aren't. When it looks like God is giving us things and when it looks like God is taking things away. It can be so easy to take the good things for granted and then blame God when the bad things happen. But even in the darkest times, there are always good things in our lives. I have a plaque on the wall that says, "When it rains, look for rainbows. When it's dark, look for stars." It's not from the Bible, but the point it's making easily could be. Even in the times of difficulty and suffering, there is still goodness and beauty to be found. When we're facing difficulties, even the most painful ones, it doesn't mean that God is bad. It doesn't mean that God has gone. It doesn't mean that God has stopped loving us and blessing us. Sometimes the blessings are obvious, and sometimes they're harder to find. But God still blesses and loves us no matter what. And actually, I've found that when I make the decision to try to love God and worship him, even when I'm struggling, that's when I start to see those small glimpses of light, those little bits of hope. The book of Job is part of what's known as the wisdom literature of the Bible. It helps us understand important things about God, the world, and our place in it. It reminds us of how big and how awesome God is. And it reminds us that we're actually rather small and don't really understand the complexity of everything. It shows us the importance of having good friends around us who can support and encourage us. When they sat beside Job in silence, his friends made a huge difference to him, reminding him that he wasn't alone, that they were there for him. When they started questioning what he had done to deserve such punishment, they were more of a curse than a blessing, if we're honest, weren't they? Is there someone you know who is struggling or suffering at the moment? Could you do something to encourage them today? Even a phone call or a note in the post to say that you're thinking of them could make such a big difference. Most importantly, the story of Job answers some of our big questions about suffering, and we're reminded of 3 incredibly important things. First of all, suffering isn't a punishment from God. Second of all, God will never turn his back on us or abandon us. Third of all, even at the worst times, there is still hope and there are still good things in our lives. I really hope you're in a place where life isn't too difficult. If that's you, then take some time to thank God today and pray for those who are struggling. And if you're in a tough place, may you know God's love and peace and presence today. May you be able to find the rainbows and the stars. God bless you.